Hello, we're going to start chapter 6 today, which is on language. Language is something that we have been working on since birth, and it's something that has a lot of power over us. So in interpersonal communication, we've been talking a lot about just communication in general, and for the next two chapters, we will focus on different aspects of communication, starting first with the specific language that we use, and then in chapter 7, talking about the nonverbal communication of that language that we're going through. So the first thing to consider is how language is symbolic. It means different things to different people. There's lots of different languages in the world, and there are multiple, within each language, there's multiple dialects and subculture, which determines different meanings with words. So an example might be that I am sick. And you could think, oh, that means that I'm not feeling well. But to someone else, if I said, I'm sick, or that's sick, or she's sick, that could mean something completely different. The word sick could be interpreted as being really cool, as being gross, and definitely, obviously, something to do with your health. So, and there are multiple examples of words throughout our language that mean different things to different people. The other thing that we know about language is that we choose different words for the subculture that we're communicating with. So you would talk differently to your professor than you would to your best friend, or differently to your mother than you would to your father even. The words that we use, the arrangement of those words, all of that speaks about us and about our relationship. So that's where language will take the stage today. So we're going to start out by going through some more details with language being symbolic. And there's three different aspects to focus on with this. There are semantic rules, syntactic rules, and pragmatic rules. And all three of those are different governances with language and the way that we use them. So let's start with semantic rules. Semantic rules relate to the way that words are assigned meanings. And these meanings can vary, but usually there's some sort of a shared understanding with it. So it's what the word means to us because of the relationship. There are four components to semantic rules: equivocal language, relative language, static evaluation, and abstract language versus behavioral language. So starting with equivocal language, this is when we know that our words have more than one commonly accepted definition. So my example of sick is an equivocal language rule, and it would mean that I would use that word and change the meaning depending on who I'm talking to. So it has more than one commonly accepted definition. The second is relative language. This is where words are gaining their meaning by comparison. So a good example of words for relative language would be like short or tall. So short compared to who? If I'm 5'9" and I'm standing next to a 6'2" person or a 6'4" person, I could be regarded as short. Whereas 5'9" in a lot of other contexts would be considered tall. So relative language, short and tall, skinny, a lot of different terms like that are just relative and only gain meaning based off of comparison. The third is static evaluation. This is where words are leading to the assumption that something is consistent or unchanging. So I am so tired. And if you use a word like tired, I am tired, it would give you the assumption that that is unchangeable. So I am bored. This is wrong. Anything that has a word in a statement with some sort of a direct yes or no to it, it becomes a static evaluation. And the thing about static evaluations is that everything is changing. So we like to use language and speak in a way that uses terms and terminology that makes it seem like it's going to go on forever and ever, but nothing ever does. So she's so annoying would be another example of that. It's a static evaluation, and it would give you the idea that that's an unchanging element, but that's actually false. Everybody changes all the time, and what's annoying to one person isn't going to be to the next. And then the last one is abstract language versus behavioral language. So from this we know that the more specific we are with our language in regards to behavior, the less abstract our language tends to be. So behavioral language is when we're describing things about somebody and what they're doing. So I walked in last night. I saw that the dishes weren't done in the sink again, and my husband was sitting at the table, and I became frustrated that he hadn't gone in and done the dishes. And that would be a specific behavior that I would be assessing. In comparison, if I did an abstract evaluation, I could come in and say, "You're never doing anything," or "I don't know why you won't help me." And so using language in an abstract way tends to create more confusion, more defensiveness. Using language that is behavior oriented tends to produce more clarity and more compliance. So, all right, so the next set is syntactic rules, and syntactic rules govern the grammar of a language. And usually we don't notice when syntactic rules have been violated until it's brought to our attention. So there's nobody really cares if you miss a comma here or there, but if it changes the meaning of something and that's drawn to your attention, then you'll notice, and it can be a problem. In your book, they give you a scenario that describes this, a Dear John letter. And in the first version, if you read through the Dear John letter, it makes it seem like the person is completely in love. So I'll read it to you. Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is all about. You are generous, kind, thoughtful. People who are not like you admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me for other men. I yearn for you. I have no feelings whatsoever when we are apart. I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours? Mary. And then on version 2, the only thing that's changed is just the syntax, which means the punctuation. Dear John, I want a man who knows what love is. All about you are generous, kind, thoughtful people who are not like you. Admit to being useless and inferior. You have ruined me. For other men I yearn. For you I have no feelings whatsoever. When we are apart, I can be forever happy. Will you let me be yours, Mary? So just by changing punctuation around, you can see how the meaning is dramatically switched. And then finally, we have pragmatic rules. And pragmatic rules are how we interpret a message in any given context. So the pragmatic rules are really the relationships that we have with other people and how those relationships and subcultures tend to change and create different types of messages. So the same statements will mean different things to different people because of the relationships that you have and because of the subculture that you belong to. So now let's move on to the next section, which talks about the impact of language overall. And the first thing to consider is the impact that language has with just your name. And think about this. What is your name? Why were you given that name? What does that name speak about you? And where did it come from? What kind of expectations do you have because you hold that name? If I was to tell you that I had children named Rain and Snow, or Canyon and Hunter, you would probably make assumptions based on me as a parent as well as my children and the way that we would raise them up. So people who name their children Maxwell versus people who name their first son something like Basil. You would have an assumption based on just the name of the culture that family probably brings their children up in and the type of personality of that person. And we know that people do tend to fit with their names. So names can be a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. The other interesting thing about names is that we tend to be biased about our own name and like people who have names similar to ours. They've done a study and people are more likely to marry someone who has a similar last name, either similar in the first letter, similar sound, or first name. So something that makes them seem like they are similar. That wasn't my case, and I'm sure that could be the situation that you're in as well, so it's not that everyone does that, but we do tend to be biased about our names, and we do tend to create other types of assumptions about people because of what they were named. So the second thing is the affiliation through convergence or divergence. And on this slide you see a picture. Those are actually my identical twin girls. and they had what's called twinnies. And twinnies is a language that identical twins most develop before they learn the language that they're being brought up in. So it usually lasts until about age 3. For my twins, their language sounded like in dit and dat and dot. And they completely understood what they were saying. None of us could understand, obviously, and so we had to teach them sign language to communicate with us because their language was being developed with each other. And that's a really good example of convergence. And what we know is that people, when they like someone else or when they find someone as similar to them, they will develop similar language traits. So when you're with someone that you like, you'll pick up things that they say. If someone is swearing, and you like them, you're more likely to swear as well. If somebody talks really quickly and you like them, you will tend to pick up your speed too. You'll notice this because the opposite is also true, which is divergence. So sometimes, like in a dating scenario, if you want to know if the person likes you and you're getting along, listen to how they're matching what you're saying. So if you start to slow down and just use brief statements, not really get into too much detail, watch and see if they do the same thing. Or if you speed up and start to get really excited and, let your voice go higher or let it go lower, and people will match the type of words and the type of language patterns with those that they like. So that's kind of an interesting thing to pay attention to. And it becomes true with nonverbal communication as well as the verbal words and patterns that we construct. And then the last one is the power of speech, and how there is differences in using polite versus powerful speech. And this has a lot to do with direction. So if you are a red personality, you're more likely to take charge, to say things in a very succinct way, to use the words I and you, and use less general terms like we or I, any sort of qualifier less often. If you are powerless, you tend to end statements on a question. And we've studied this and found out that women in particular do this a lot. So they'll do it either by, is that true, or in just my opinion, or they'll do it with their word, with whatever words that they're using, just the intonation of their voice so that it ends it on a question. So they'll say, I don't know, maybe this is where we should go for lunch, and they'll end up. So it seems like it's a question. And that has been found to be linked with powerless speech. So if you are in any sort of a scenario where you want to get a leadership position, you want to use more powerful speech. And there's a difference, though, between powerful speech and impolite speech. So don't confuse the idea of just, I need you to do this, get this done, as powerful and positive speech. They found that when bosses and those in leadership positions will be direct and succinct and not use questions at the end of their terms, let their voice come down at the end, or not add some sort of a qualifier, that's positive. But also using politeness is positive. So instead of walking in the room and saying, grab me a cup of coffee, walking into the room and saying, hey, would you mind getting me a cup of coffee? And then saying, obviously, thank you afterwards, does go along with being powerful. Otherwise, you're just seen as a jerk, and you might be in a powered situation, but nobody's going to really want to listen to you. So you do need the politeness with it as well. All right, now we're going to go through and talk about some disruptive language and what types of language could possibly be negative. So the first is fact-opinion confusion, the second is fact-inference confusion, and the third is emotive language. So first, on fact-opinion confusion. Factual statements are claims that can be verified as true or false. And opinion statements are based on speakers' beliefs. So a fact might be, you forgot my birthday. But an opinion would be off of that you don't care about me. And that would obviously could be stated as a fact, but the idea that someone doesn't care about you is definitely based on your own interpretation. So another fact might be, you keep interrupting me. But an opinion off of that could be, you're a control freak. And you'll notice, listen to everyday conversations, and you'll hear that people present opinions as if they were facts. And because we do this, it invites unnecessary argumentation and defensiveness. So your book gives you a couple of examples. That was a dumb thing to say, or spending that much on a pair of shoes is a waste of money. You know, all of that sounds like a fact. It sounds like it's something that is static in its evaluation, but it's actually just an opinion. Who says how much is too much for a pair of shoes? You know, that's your opinion that that would be so. Or who says that was a smart or a stupid thing to say? That's obviously up to the listener to decide. So the next is fact inference confusion, and fact inference confusion is when we confuse factual statements with inferential statements. So these are conclusions that have been arrived from an interpretation of evidence. So we are interpreting something that that may have been a fact, but it has some sort of an inference. It has an interpretation based off of that. So your book brings up this example. Why are you mad at me? And the responder says, I'm not mad at you. Why have you been so insecure lately? And the other person says, I'm not insecure. It's just that you've been so critical. And the other person says, what do you mean critical? I haven't been critical. And so we just continue to build conclusions based off of the information that people are saying to us. So based off of the language and the statements that they're making, we create our own statements and inferences off of that. And you can see how that escalates issues really quickly when all that we're doing is just creating an inference or an opinion off of what was stated. So something to do to help with if you're struggling with fact inference sort of disruptive language patterns is to use perception checking. So instead of just creating a meaning off of what somebody says, and that meaning usually is laden with some sort of a judgment, use a perception checking statement where you make sure that the way that you're interpreting things with your perception is accurate. So the last section is on emotive language. And emotive language relates to things that will bring up the truth of the speaker's attitude. So it usually has to do with approval and disapproval. And if you approve, those emotive terms tend to be positive. If you disapprove, those emotive terms tend to be negative. So your book brings up a couple of examples here. If you approve of something, you'll say thrifty. If you disapprove, you're going to say cheap. If you approve of something, you'll say traditional. If you disapprove, old-fashioned. And the list goes on. So for the same situation, for the exact same scenario, the language that we choose does give an idea of how we feel emotionally about it. And if you start to listen to the specific terminology, you can hear the positive or a negative approval that someone has about something or someone. So when we're using emotive language, we usually aren't giving very accurate information that can be perceived very easily, because they won't know why you approve or you disapprove, or you might not even understand why your emotions are where they are. But understanding that you are using descriptive emotive language is a good step to see. So then you can understand what you're feeling and why you might feel the way that you do. And just by being able to pick up that I'm speaking emotively favorably about this, or I'm emotively unfavorable about whatever it is that I'm talking about. Now we're going to go through the language of responsibility. So besides making sure that the content of a message is clear, the language in the way that the speaker uses their language to take responsibility for what they're saying adds a whole other layer. So there tends to be it statements, but statements, questions, you language, we language, and I statements that we have available to us as we're crafting our specific language out. Let's start by going through it statements. It statements replace personal pronouns I with less immediate words like it. So I language is going to, in contrast, take responsibility. Its statements are going to avoid responsibility and avoid taking a position. So it becomes the issue. It's a boring class versus I'm bored in the class, or it's nice to see you versus I'm glad to see you, or it bothers me that you're late, or I'm worried because you're late. So it allows us to take the responsibility and put it off of either person. So the next we'll go through are but statements. These are statements that take the form of X but Y, which can be somewhat confusing. They're usually used when you have a somewhat negative message that you need to portray, but you want to soften the blow a little bit. So you add something positive to it. So I really like you and think that you're a great person, but I'm just not ready for a relationship right now. That might be an example of trying to get out of being with somebody. And so you say something positive, and then you include the negative on top of that. So what usually happens in these scenarios are that we discount the positive and we just focus on the negative. So your book brings up the example, you're a really great person, but I think we ought to stop seeing each other. Or you've done good work for us, but we're going to have to let you go. In both of those situations, I'm sure that you're not leaving that scenario feeling great and like, oh, they really value me. They didn't want to let me go. You just hear that you were fired, or you just hear that this person wants to break up with you. So you may have heard of the compliment sandwich, which is where you compliment them at the beginning and then you put something negative in and then you compliment them at the end. That's a little bit different. Not only have you got more positives than negatives, but also if you include it in a way that each are individual statements, not a but statement with them connected together, then they tend to hold individual weight. So the third are questions, and some questions are sincere requests for information, but others have a way of avoidance. And so because they're ending with a question, it's something that's opening up for interpretation or perhaps is holding a hidden hint. So your book brings up, what are we having for dinner? Which could hide the statement that whatever you want, like I want to go out and eat pizza, but instead of saying that you say, what are we having for dinner? So it avoids responsibility and it also opens up the door for a hint. So another example could be, do you love me? Which is going to replace any sort of statement, because maybe I'm trying to say I love you, or I don't love you. And instead of doing that and taking accountability, I just ask the question out, do you love me? Which can mean a lot of different things. So there's usually a hidden hint with that, and it's an indirect way to approach a topic that perhaps you're not super comfortable with. So the next section are, in your book, it's your I and you language together. But we're going to talk about I language in just a minute. So let's just focus on the you language. You language expresses judgments on the other person. Positive judgments rarely are going to cause you any problems, but negative judgments will make people feel uncomfortable, and they will usually reject or at least feel extremely defensive because you used it. So you left this place in a mess, or you don't keep your promises, you're really crude. Using you language like that is going to make someone feel like they have to either defend themselves because of it or explain themselves. If you use you language like, you are amazing, you have done such a wonderful job, then even though those are still judgments that are based off of interpretations, that person is more likely to believe you and believe the statement and not be mad about it. Just be like, yes, I am amazing. I'm glad that you noticed. So negative you statements tend to be rejected. Positive you statements tend to be accepted regardless of truth. So the we language, let's go through next. We language is the language of shared responsibility. So we language are building in the idea and the climate that you're somewhat in this together. We are going to be responsible. So we have a problem keeping our room clean, or we need to work on our arguing and conflict resolution. That puts the blame on both people together. It doesn't let one person be a problem. So it doesn't necessarily avoid responsibility, but it doesn't directly take it either. The problem with we language would be if you use it in a way where clearly somebody does have a problem, and instead of telling them about that, you are just like trying to soften it. So a good example of this might be that your roommate will not pick up their socks. They are always leaving their shoes and socks all over your apartment. And so you could walk in and say, we tend to have a problem keeping our socks off the floor. And if it clearly is them that has the problem, you're always picking up your socks, they will know that it's their problem. And it just becomes condescending that, oh, we have a little problem here, that you won't just directly come out and call it for what it is. So use we language when you can share in that responsibility. Now let's go through I statements. And I statements will take the speaker and let them take the responsibility for their part of the situation. It refrains from judgment overall, so I statements do tend to be one of the most positive types of language statements to use, especially if you will include what the book brings up, which is the other person's behavior, your interpretations, your feelings, and the consequences of that person's behavior. Those are actually elements of what's called the clear message format, which we will learn as a way of conflict resolution later. So these steps will come back up. But they are very effective at making sure that you get the information across that you need to, so that they understand how you are feeling and how you are responding and taking responsibility for what's happening. So a scenario might be you walk in from class and your roommate is, has locked themselves in their room. They've had a really bad day. They won't talk to you. You don't know if it's a bad day. You don't know what it is, but they are completely isolating themselves away from you. And no matter what you do, you can't get them to talk to you. So you could go up to them and say, hey, what's your problem? Or you're just locking yourself in your room all the time. Or you could go in and use we language and say, we tend to not be communicating very well. But really, if it's you that's having the problem, using I language is the best, because you are feeling upset. I am feeling upset about this. We don't know what the other person is, or if they even want to talk to you or not. So approaching it from your own perspective is the most honest. So if I was to use the 4 things in the I statement, I would go up to that roommate and say, hey, I've noticed that you're in your room, and I'm not sure if you're in your room because you just need a little bit of break for me, or if something happened in class, but I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling worried that there's something going on that I can't help you with, and the consequences would be, and I'm just concerned that if I don't talk to you about this now, I'm going to let my head build in all sorts of scenarios that will maybe not be true and not be what I need to be thinking about, and I just want us to have a positive relationship. So now let's go through a little bit more about gender and language. And remember that with this, as we go through this, the book will break up things between men and women, but it really has a lot to do with the gender of your brain and the style of communication that you adopt. So there are those of us who are masculine communicators, even though we're women, or feminine communicators, even though we're men, and those of us who are androgynous, which means that in certain situations we can be more direct and masculine, and other situations will be more feminine and caring. So just take all of this with a grain of salt. But these are the stereotypes between men and women. So in regards to content, women do tend to discuss relationship problems, family, health, reproductive matters, weight, food, and clothing, while men tend to discuss music, current events, sports, business, and other men. And those are like the content discussions that they tend to have. Men tend to want to communicate to accomplish a job, while women tend to want to communicate to nourish relationships. And as far as conversational style, men tend to be more direct, succinct, and task-oriented, while women tend to be more indirect, elaborate, emotional, and focused on relationships. So some non-gender variables would be the overall social philosophy, whether or not you're feminist, conservative, or liberal, which is going to change the type of language that you use, or if you're cooperative or competitive in your overall orientation. So if you're a red personality, you tend to, that's a competitive orientation, and you will use language based off of that, versus cooperative, which would be like a blue type of personality. Your occupation does tend to allow you to create different language patterns. If you are the warden of a prison, you are going to communicate a certain way to your children versus a kindergarten teacher. So the type of words that you use, the pattern of that language, being direct or indirect, or powerful or powerless, polite, all of that does tend to go along with your occupation. And sometimes we'll notice people change in their overall personality just because they've changed a job. So if you are a law enforcement agent and then you go into teaching, you might notice different things about your personality just because you're now no longer using language that reinforces a particular type of occupation. There doesn't tend to be much difference with the use of profanities, qualifiers, or tag questions. I know you probably heard that men swear more than women. That's not really the case. The idea that men are from Mars and women are from Venus has also been dispelled, and in fact, like your book brings up, it's more like men are from North Dakota and women are from South Dakota, meaning that we have a lot of similar patterns, and we're more similar than we are different, although there does tend to be these like relationship sorts of, and emotional sorts of issues that women will focus on more than men. So there's a little bit of difference, but it's not really like you're on a different planet. So as far as gender roles go, we know that the gender role that you adopt is going to influence your communication more than your biological sex. So if you decide to be a stay-at-home father, for example, this will influence your communication pattern. It'll influence the type of language that you use, what you talk about more than your biological sex. And if you become the provider of the family and you are a female, you will tend to take on more patriarchal sorts of ideas. So being the head of the household, being the person that makes the decisions. And sometimes that's just the expectation, sometimes it's the necessity, so that, and obviously your gender role can match your biological sex as well. So, but that does play a role. Masculine communicators tend to use more dominance overall, while feminine communicators are going to use powerless speech, and they will try to help other people feel, comfortable instead of putting themselves above them. And this is when it's most appropriate to be used is best. So you have to kind of watch, because otherwise, like I talked about before, you can really just become kind of powerless because everything is ending on a question. So kind of be careful with that. The idea to identify your communication style is a good one, especially when you are trying to determine the different communication pattern responses and what would be appropriate to bring up with a particular individual or in a different situation. If you can tell that you're dealing with a feminine communicator, be aware of that and know that they will look for ways to build the relationship and to create emotional bonding. If you can tell that you're dealing with someone who is more masculine in their style, then use that in your patterned responses. This means that they're going to want, that dominance will be an issue, first of all, and they're going to want to get to the point and make decisions quickly. So do that. There's also verbal communication styles in regards to culture. So low context cultures tends to be like the United States and Canada, or any Western liberal democracy tends to be a little bit more low context. So when you're at a low context culture, you're looking for the meaning of a statement. And you're not really looking for what other people think about that. You're looking for something literal and concrete. So you tend to express your thoughts, feelings, ideas clearly and logically and directly. If you're in a high context culture, such as in Asia or the Middle East, you'll discover meaning from the context of the message. So it's not the meaning of what you're saying, it's the context of where that statement is made, or what the scenario of that statement held. This language will be used to maintain social harmony over an individuality. So instead of saying things that make you stand out, you say things to help everybody feel equal and positive. And this is why they tend to not use as much eye contact as well, because it's not about putting yourself above anyone else, it's about being part of that group. So in a high context culture, we tend to try to find agreement and compromise, and the language can be either elaborate or can be more succinct. It doesn't really matter as long as you're finding agreement and compromise and you're trying to make the overall group better rather than yourself better. In verbal communication styles in regards to culture, there's three main differences. The clarity and vagueness is one. So being clear or being vague tends to be culture driven. The elaborate or succinctness of what you're saying is directly linked to your culture, and the formality versus the informality of how you talk tends to be regarded right from your culture. And last is the language and worldview, and we will go through both linguistic relativism and the Sparrow-Whorf hypothesis. So linguistic relativism is a term which relates to the worldview of a culture being shaped and reflected by the language that its members speak. So in your book it brings up the idea of Eskimos having over 100 words for what we would call snow. Now the reason that they would develop more than 100 words for snow is because they live up in the ice and snow, and so much of their livelihood depends on that. They have to be able to communicate about it in different ways. Where we live, we don't need to have that type of language difference, and so we have one word for snow, or possibly two if you consider like sleet and hail, as a form of snow. But Eskimos have up to 100 words because of necessity. So linguistic relativism means that we would shape our idea of our world based off of, and we develop language based off of those needs. So the Spar-Whorf hypothesis relates to how language shapes our reality overall. And your book brings up the Hopi people study, which when they've studied the Hopi people culture and their language, they found out that linguistic relativism is a part of this, and that so they have different words, right, that relate to what they mean. And in regards to their culture, this shapes their overall worldview because these words also don't tend to have past and present. They just have, or past and future, they just have present in their terminology. So they don't use like something happened or it will happen. It just, something is happening. And so their language keeps things in the present. And because they keep things in the present, then it changes the way that they have to talk about a lot of things. So like parenting, if you can't tell someone not to do something that they did in the past, or you can't tell someone not to do something in the future, it really makes you focus just on the now. And that changes your reality. If you want to learn something, you don't go and ask someone how they did it. You sit and observe. You don't ask someone to tell you about it tomorrow. You follow them around doing whatever that is that they're doing. So it really shapes their overall reality because they don't have the past and present as things that they talk about. So that's the chapter on language. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you next time for nonverbal communication.